This is Wandering Universe. Today, we're going to explore an island, which is virtually a dot, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, far, far, far away from where I live. And believe it or not, I actually travelled there once, actually twice, as a stopover when I was 9 years old. And the place I'm going to explore today is called Easter Island. So, let's go exploring. Okay, here's the map of the Pacific Ocean and the Polynesian Islands, as you can see here. So it's not very far away from where I live. Now, Easter Island is just here, as you can see. Okay, now, next map. I'll show you Google Map. Here it is. Here's another one. So as you can see, where the coastline is mapped out and the one and only capital city. And we're going to get to another picture in just a moment. So let me just run through its history of the island. Easter Island is one of the most remote and isolated islands on Earth. It's so remote that its nearest neighbour, Tahiti, is 1,600 kilometres southeast and 3,200 kilometres off the west coast of Chile. It's virtually just a dot in the Pacific Ocean. Even whilst you're flying over the ocean at night, you can hardly see it, and I know, I've seen it myself as a 9-year-old. Maybe just see a speck of light. It's that tiny. Its closest island is 1,400 miles away that still remains uninhabited. Easter Island, or as the indigenous islanders call it, Rapa Nui, is 15 miles long and 10 miles wide. Like I said, it's virtually just a dot in the ocean. The vast expanse of the land is mostly treeless, with the occasional scrub brushes. And I'll just show you a picture here. There it is. I know, not a tree in sight. Even when I visited the island itself, I was shocked how bare it was. But I can tell you that a little later. The wilderness itself is mostly scorched grasses, thanks to the extinct volcano that left behind this scrub land. And I'll show you another picture here. Yep, that's what it looks like from the air. That's on a clear day, by the way. I actually landed on a very windy day. And let me tell you, it wasn't that enjoyable. Yet, there is an interesting story behind this picture as to why today it still remains treeless with very few wildlife roaming the skies and land. And I'll talk about that in another video. Rapa Nui Island has been through several stages of human colonisation that made the island both alluring and perilous, given to the treacherous nature humans have brought upon the almost complete destruction of the land. Although the island does share a dark human history, it has left a black mark that will be forever imprinted in the minds of the indigenous people. Okay, so I'm going to show you more. That's the rocky shoreline. And that's how the indigenous people of the past looked like, as you can see. Quite attractive, mind you. Some historians and archaeologists have placed the island's inhabited history as far back between 900 to 1200 AD. The origin of the Rapa Nui people came from what is believed from the Pacific Polynesian Islands. Between 300 to 700 CE, a small group of Polynesian people travelled the very long journey across the Pacific Ocean via large canoes. At the same time, putting up with sometimes treacherous waves, at times heavy rainfall, and not often ferocious winds. Okay, and like I said, the day I landed was a goddamn windy day. I'll never forget how turbulent it was. It was so turbulent you could see the wings flapping as I looked out the window. Nevertheless, they managed to sail across using an ingenious navigating system by following the stars that mapped their trek in the night sky. Their voyage finally paid off. Through their curious eyes, they spotted land ahead, and alas, they set foot on an island they never thought possibly existed. Rapa Nui displayed a wonderful wilderness beauty with fertile plains, volcanic vegetation, a mild subtropical climate, lack of predators so the threat of danger was low, huge palm trees, ferns, herbs and tree daisies. The extinct volcano called, I think it's Ronukai, which is now a crater as I showed you in the previous photo, offered an abundant source of fresh water so they wouldn't die of thirst. Now, here's how they arrived. That's the style of canoe they built, and that's how they arrived. Interesting to see that. I think it's called hahu trees that produced strong rope, and Toromiro trees that produced dry type of firewood for cooking food and kept them warm at night. They found some interesting form of edible nuts and sugar that produced fermented wine as a means of entertaining their guests. Most of all, the amazingly abundant palm trees that grew up to 82 feet tall provided ample shade during the hot summer months and good shelter to house a minimal colonized society full of Polynesian tribes. But wait, there's more. A vast variety of seabirds, 25 different types of nesting birds, called the island home. Ah, yes, they finally found paradise. Life was good, but not for long. A tragic series of events were about to unfold, unbeknownst to the colonized settlers' landmark history. These fantastic palm trees were exploited for one solid purpose. I'll get into the story behind these. Yes, as you can see. These big beasties, I call them, in another video. But first, this. The Polynesian Society were divided into two groups, the long-eared people and short-eared people. Now, I'll just show you what they look like. Okay. So that's how they looked back then. They both lived amongst themselves happily for a long time. Archaeologists discovered, whilst they unearthed large trash piles of porpoise bones, this suggests they were skilled fishermen, and huge quantities of Polynesian rat bones. It is believed that these were stowaway pests that brought onto the island, and they consumed them purposely. The tribes spread themselves throughout the 63 square mile island, and over time the population grew between 7,000 to 20,000 people. Alas, happy times on the island were drawing to a close. Now, I'll just see. The divided tribes were not happy. By the 14th century, the luscious and once thriving palm tree forest was being destroyed. Deforestation had occurred, and a big rat infestation began to eat its way through the land. These mighty and disgusting pests almost wiped out the rich bird life population, pollinate the ground vegetation, ruin their beautiful crops, their colourful gardens, and eroded the soil, and canoes began to fall into disrepair. Even the porpoise bones from the trash piles began to disappear. Their bountiful diet of fish came to an end. The tribes began to find other means to eat, such as domesticated chickens they brought over from home, rats, and scavenged fruits. Once all this began to run out fast, they turned to the one means of last resort they never dared to consume: each other. Yes, cannibalism. The tribes were on the brink of starvation and resource depletion. Trust was no longer viable, and they saw each other as enemies of the world. And so, during the 1750s, a new warrior class tribe turned to warfare, and yes, violence ensued. A new civil war uprising. With little choice, many fled to the caves for safety, whilst the defeated tribes began to topple over the adorning statues they so proudly sculptured to please the gods. Now, I'll just show you what I mean. This is what I'm talking about. But I'll leave this as a teaser in another video coming up. They were angry, all right. Then, in 1722, a new wave of humans arrived at the land. A Dutch explorer, Jacob Roggeveen landed on the shores on Easter Sunday, coincidentally, Easter Island. By the time he set foot on the sandy beach, he noticed there was hardly any natural resources left during his time. Now, I'll just show you what he actually saw. This, okay? Yes, not much left you can, dig up or plant, let alone even build on. So this is what he found. Curious, he decided to walk around to find anyone home, and what he found shocked him. There were only 2,000 of the people left, and the island was a vast wasteland. And yet, the European settlers, most from the Netherlands, began to set up camp and called the island home. The colonized population grew from 2,000 to 3,000, all thanks to farming. Yet it has resulted in him and his men killing a dozen islanders and wounding many others. This is where the tragedy of the island unfolds. It then turned into a regular seaport for whalers and other explorers. The Rapa Nui people were welcoming at first, especially the women. Good lure, or little ticket to the island. Peaceful island living soon turned ugly, as you can see. During the 1860s, a slave trade raided the island. Peruvian slave traders, Peruvian slave raiders, began to take stock whoever was up for grabs to sell for a cheap price. These violent abductions went on for several months, capturing 1,500 men and women. That's pretty horrific if you ask me. Sailors shot them like game if they were aggressive or excitable. The men were used for slave labour, and the women were forced into prostitution. A very sad end. Worst of all, the women were infected from foreigners with sexually transmitted diseases. They didn't have the immunity to heal, and once again the population began to decline. The public grew furious at the Peruvian government and told them to end the slavery and send them all back to where they belonged. When they were brought back, there was only 100 of them left, and after a long journey back from Peru, the freed slaves brought back a tragic souvenir. Smallpox. Yes, it couldn't get any worse, could it? By 1900, the population slowly grew back. In 2012, there are now 5,761 people living on the island who are mostly Polynesian descent. Now, I'm going to show you the capital city over here, and I'll talk more about this in my next video. But for now, this is the only township that I knew of at the time when I landed many years ago. And as you can see, I believe that's the airport. You can tell by the landing strip there. And I think we came here, and then they took us to that side, either that side of the island or somewhere around the island, or possibly around here. So that's where we went. I didn't go alone. I went with my parents, of course. We went to explore the island as a stopover for a few hours. Now, what remains? Now, I'm going to ask a few questions about this particular island. What interests me most is the statues. The statues are incredibly interesting. I mean, they're not only fascinating to stare at, but there's something about them that's just eroded in my mind for a very long time. And I saw these things when I was watching a show called Greatest Mysteries of the World, which was a TV show I used to watch on a Saturday afternoon before the stupid news came along. And there was one thing that really caught my imagination was seeing those giant statues on this tiny island. And I saw this, I think, about a year ago before my parents actually went over there for a stopover before we went to Chile to stay there for about a week or two as a holiday. So I remember just getting off the plane, and then this is the story. My father was approached by some so-called touristy guide who asked him, hey, seeing you're not going to get off the island for a few hours, and while you're waiting, do you want me to take you to see the statues on the island? And typically my father, he was very reluctant to even go exploring, said no, he'd rather just stand there and have a cigarette or two before he could just, eagerly get on board the plane. But I wanted to see it. I said, come on, Dad, we got to see it. We got to see it. I've seen this on the TV show. I've got to see it. We've got to see them in real life. Come on, I've got to see it. And reluctantly he said, all right, we'll go. And then he put his cigarette out, and we all went in this car. Looked like something from the 1970s, some sort of like Lincoln Blue wagon or something like that. Anyway, so we drove out on this short highway, and then it didn't take long. It took about maybe a few minutes. And then, Lord and behold, just on the horizon, just a little bit over the hill, there it was. It was mind-blowing. It was right in front of me in the distance. And there they were, the big beasties, I called them at the time. And they were, even though they were tiny from, my perspective, when you really went up close, they were huge. And I mean huge. I mean, I was only this small and they were like this tall. I mean, you need more than just a ladder to actually climb up to, just stand on top of one of them if you actually dared. And I remember that I actually walked on top of the platform and looked over behind one of the statues, and I'll show you which one it was. Yes, it was this one. And I walked over here. I think it's between that one and that one. I walked over because I was very curious, and behind it I saw a couple of statues that were already toppled over, and one of them was broken in half. So that fascinated me for a long time. I mean, it just imprinted me. Actually imprinted the fascination of these statues. How were they built? Why were they built? And how they were moved across the island. So ever since then, I've been wanting to talk about this, and now today, many years later, I've got the opportunity to actually talk to you about it. So this is good. I'm really enjoying this. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about these huge beasties, I will call them. I'm going to talk about how they were created, how they were made, how they were transported, how they moved around the island from the quarry, and who made them. That's very interesting. But it's important to understand the history of the island first, so you can get a good understanding why the landscape is as it is, okay? And I'll tell you a few theories on how the landscape became treeless. Was it climate change? Was it human intervention? I'll explain that in the next video. So, this is what's left. So, these trees are not even close to 3 feet tall. And that's the city once again. And this is an old illustration of Captain James Cook, who visited the island in 1772. And he was absolutely amazed and curious about how these statues arrived on the island. and how they were made. So he was very curious. He even said that by the time he arrived at the island, he noticed that many of them were toppled over. The story he was told by the indigenous people was that there was a tribal civil war, and that's the tribes were angry at the gods. This is the story, and that they pushed the statues over. Mind you, they are incredibly heavy, and they are, and I'll tell you that a little later. So these are the tribal people, and these are the visitors. And here's another depiction of the island itself at the time. This is in the 1800s, and these are at the time these big beasties were still standing on the platforms. Now some of them, as you can see, I'll show you, are facing inland, and some of them are facing out to the sea. Now that's very interesting, and I'll tell you that in another video. Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, has been marked by a tragic history of exploitation, political interference, and broken promises of a once beautiful paradise scorched by the tragic events caused by pneumatic, complacent, and often ego-driven, power-hungry, mad humans whose only real purpose was to invade, conquer, and destroy, to be top dog of the land. Their immoral compass dictated their bad choices, which demonstrated their shitty leadership values that made many islanders question their moral ideologies on how to live a happy and so-called peaceful island paradise. Until this day, many Polynesian islanders still question white man's ways that brought on their societal collapse in more ways than you can imagine. Though they mitigate peacefully, they are still hurt and profoundly angry at those in charge who still refuse to give back the land these islanders once claimed, who called it their paradise dream home. That's all for now.